17104.com. This is Zanetta Wingfield, and you're listening to The Voice 17104.com. The Voice 17104.com.
Hello and welcome. I'd like to invite you to just enjoy the experience that we're about to encounter. I'd like to introduce to you a man of a very humble beginning, a man that was able to overcome the horrific misclassification of special education. A caring man, a man that will encourage you because he's been there and done that. And I'd like to encourage you to keep an open mind and be empowered to change your life. I'd like to present to you a man of men, Richard Utley. Richard Utley.
Welcome to Did You Know? Podcast. Your host, Richard Utley, dedicated to the African American viewers. The program is aimed to celebrate African American culture and deal with the real and relevant topics that impact the everyday lives of the African American community through frank and insightful dialogue with local and national influencers. Every day, there is another horrible, discouraging news story, directly or indirectly impacting African Americans. But we need to look at the shining stars in the galaxy of Black America. It is time to tell our story.
Oh, mercy, mercy me. Oh, things what they used to be. No.
Good evening, good evening, good evening. And welcome to another Did You Know? Oh, we have a pretty interesting program tonight. First, I want to talk about a couple of things. There's some hearings going on, those congressional hearings, and I hope a lot of you are watching that and paying attention to it. And if you're not watching it, just look at a segment of it to get a feel where this country is going and where it's been. January 6th was a very, very, very touchy situation. And as we all know, especially in the Black community, if that would have been us marching on January 6th, they would have had the tanks come down and roll us over. And we know that. And so therefore, it's interesting to see so you can see the double standards in America. Also, I want you, audience, I want you to keep a couple of things in mind. And one of the things I want you to keep in mind is that you got to keep your eye on what's going on up at Capitol Hill. We can't fall asleep on that. And the reason I said that, I'm sure it was many of you probably don't know, but down in New Mexico, they had an election, a primary election, and on the Republican side, and they decided they didn't want to count the votes, talking about something was wrong with the machine. So this is just a prelude of what's going to happen in November. So we need to get out to vote, and we need to register to vote. And so tonight, what I decided to do, since we all been running around and jumping up and we were all happy this weekend and Juneteenth, I decided that I was going to bring one of my good friends on. And we're going to have a very frank discussion. And I'm going to say this to my audience now. You're going to hear a lot of things. I want you to think. That's the most important part about this. I want you to think about this conversation. So I have the good fortune of having my good friend on, Lenwood Sloan. I'm going to have Lenwood tell you who he is. He's been on before, and many of you know that I have the Central Pennsylvania Black Directory, and he's the one that writes all those wonderful articles about different situations, whether it's about barbers, whether it's about the firemen. And the reason he writes those articles because he wants us to understand history. So I have him on tonight. And what we're really going to talk about is the real deal of Juneteenth. So it's going to be lightning. It's going to be interesting. Then we'll tell my audience who you are.
Greetings, Richard, and greetings to your audience. Richard and I are part of the original Waybacks. We go way back to the movement of Martin Luther King, Medgar Evers, John and Jesse, and were young men. Rosa Parks was 23, and we were organized, trained, and educated to be activists and integrationists in the best sense of that term. I'll use that a lot tonight, about integrating ourselves in to the American enterprise as well as the American dream. My two loves in school were the arts and civics and politics, and I have been able to have a long career as a professional artist. First career as a dancer in the Alvin Ailey School, second career as a director on and off Broadway in the Lincoln Center Directing School, and my third life in history and education and government and politics and philanthropy. So I have been given this great opportunity to write about Black enterprise and the vitality of Black economics through the vantage point of what is left behind in culture. And usually when a culture rises to its zenith and then falls, the things that are left behind are its art and its historic relics and its historic dates. And so I am approaching Juneteenth from a deeper political analysis than the picnic, parade, and party tonight. That's who I am.
Okay, what I'd like to do, I'm going to read a poem. And after I read this poem, then this is going to kick it into the program. It's a Juneteenth poem. I heard it through the cotton fields from hymns they sang in church. We have been free for 2.5 years. Texas masters tell us we are not lying since 1863. They said the messenger was killed, so they worked us fast to read one last cotton, for them to just do one cotton crop before the news arrived. Strange how field troops, federal, never showed up. They were delayed for years. While we tried to survive, they came in 1865. General Granger and his troops overthrew the Texas resistance on June 19th. Now we know as Juneteenth, and African Americans, the day slavery ended in the United States and the state of Texas, the Emancipation was. And this is by Beatrice W. Vassar. What do you think of that poem? I wanted to kick it off with that. So basically what the poem is saying, I want to paraphrase it here. It's saying it took 2.5 years before those folks in Texas, which we project about 250,000 that were slaves, didn't even know they was free. That's number one. And number two, there was no message. We didn't know that this was going on, even though we would know that back then they had a way of getting the message out, as well as those people who were opposed to slavery. I would have thought that they would have some kind of way let people know. There was newspapers. There were all kinds of information out there. But yet they never sent the federal troops to enforce it. And so it seems like it took us, especially in Texas, 2.5 years that we didn't know that we was free. So could you paraphrase that and give us something to start to talk about?
This is a great poem, Richard, and audience, because it unveils a number of very, very important things. Early in the poem, for example, it says, it took 2.5 years for General Granger's troops to get there and overthrow the insurrection. And that's very important, Richard, because it wasn't 2.5 years before people knew that they were legislatively free. It was 2.5 years before the legislation was enforced enough to impact on their condition of bondage. I'm gonna say that again. There was a term, Richard, that came out about a month ago now in the news, and it was called strategic ambiguity. And I thought that was such a interesting political phrase for us to use in 2022 because it fit so well Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. Lincoln was a lawyer, and lawyers don't give up anything for free. You always get something. So Lincoln wrote the Emancipation Proclamation as a document of supreme strategic ambiguity. The document, which was published in September of 1862, was an ultimatum to the states that had seceded from the Union. An ultimatum. The ultimatum said that unless you return to the Union by January 1st of 1863, all your enslaved people will be considered by the federal government to be free. Unless you return to the Union by January 1st of 1863. Well, we all know that no state returned to the Union. No, not one of the 11 states that has seceded from the Union. Consider his executive order. And remember, an executive order is not an act, a resolution, or a bill. It is only sustained for the life of the term of the president. So, since Lincoln was assassinated in April of 1863, his executive order, Richard, was null and void after his death by Juneteenth. So, I'll put that over on the window to rise like bread because it wasn't even effective anymore by the time Granger got there. But it said all your enslaved people will be considered to be free by January 1st of 1863. Well, Lincoln started in Pennsylvania in August of 1862 with something that was called the Governor's Conference. And it was convened by Governor Curtin of Pennsylvania, one of the top champions of Abraham Lincoln. And incidentally, why Harrisburg was the seat of the training of military soldiers at Camp Curtin in Pennsylvania. But Governor Curtin invited governors from the free states above the Mason-Dixon line to meet him for 2 hours in Altoona, Pennsylvania. It was a totally secret meeting. Governors from Massachusetts, New York, New Jersey, all came by train to Altoona, Pennsylvania. They crossed the train station to the hotel. They stood in the ballroom and they had a 4-hour meeting to decide whether Lincoln had enough votes to launch the ultimatum to the South. And Curtin and Pennsylvania committed to making sure that Lincoln had enough votes. So Pennsylvania is very important to the passage of the Emancipation Proclamation. And in September, Lincoln felt safe enough that he would place the ultimatum before the South. But the month before, Richard, he did something really equally as important, that we completely forget about. And that was through executive order, he emancipated all the enslaved people in Washington, D.C. in August of 1862. Through executive order, he emancipated all enslaved people in the District of Columbia, and he shut down the slave markets in Washington. That meant that that spring, Southern planters could not purchase blocks of enslaved people from Washington, D.C., which was one of the primary supporters of what was called blocks. Blocks is 200 enslaved people sold in one block to work in cotton or cane or some crop that required huge sets of organized labor enforcement. Now, when Lincoln emancipated the enslaved people in Washington, D.C. in August of 1863, shortly after the Gettysburg invasion, Lincoln decided what he was going to do is he was going to repair every slave owner in Washington. What that mean, Richard? He was going to pay them the $300 to $500 per enslaved person in Washington. He was not only going to free the enslaved people in Washington, but he was going to repair the cost that the master lost in his commodity. Through his treasurer came to him and said, "You're out of your mind. We don't have that much money. You can't do that. You can't pay all these people, for their enslaved people. You can't." He tried it in Washington, D.C. In fact, he also tried in Delaware. That's the second part of the Emancipation Proclamation, Richard, because the Emancipation Proclamation says, unless you return to the Union by January 1st, all your enslaved people are going to be free. So what about Delaware and New Jersey and Kentucky and Missouri and West Virginia that did not leave the Union? Therefore, they held on to their slaves, Richard. So while the Emancipation Proclamation was attempting to reduce the workforce in the fields of the southern states, it was allowing Delaware and Jersey and Maryland, the biggest slave market outside of Washington, D.C. and Philadelphia was Maryland. It was allowing them to keep their enslaved people. And those enslaved people in those states, those 5 states which are called the border states, they were not freed until the 13th Amendment in December of 1863. That's what freed them. But as far as the Emancipation Proclamation, Lincoln didn't free enslaved people, and neither did the Emancipation. The military might of the federal forces, which invaded the South, and as they crushed each Southern Confederate army, they read the Emancipation to that army, to that community, and they announced to the masters that they had to lay down their guns and they had to free their enslaved people, and that they had to hire them at fair wages for their work. Nobody believed any of that. It's the difference between legislation, which is the law, and enforcement and enactment, which is the administration of the law. Unless you have administration of the law, you don't have nothing. So it was the federal army and the Union Army that went through the South, state by state, community by community, county by county, church field and marketplace. And as they conquered the Confederate Army they were able to practice what was called the Confiscation Act, which was to confiscate the enslaved people and put them under the protection of the Union Army as contraband of the war. They passed the Confiscation Act, which allows the Army to confiscate enslaved people, and they passed the Contraband Act, which made those people the property of the Union Army. Usually they became butchers, barbers, wagoners, you name it, anything that you needed. Those of you who've been in the military know that the quartermaster has all their vendors and all their service. And those enslaved people who were freed by military action in the South fell behind the Union Army in protection and became part of the workforce of the Union Army.
Let me talk to you about a couple other things. Let's talk about, I got several things I want to talk about. Let's talk about reparations to the slave owners.
Can I say one more thing, Richard, before we go to reparation? So when Granger came to Galveston on June 16th, Richard, of 1863, he came there to do three things. He came there to announce to the sympathizers of the South and the Confederate Army that they had to put their guns down, and he had 2,000 soldiers to help him, force them to put their guns down. He came to the masters to say, despite the fact that it's June, your fields are full of cotton, full of corn, full of tobacco. I'm gonna take your workers away from you, and you have to pay them now. And the third was Federal Act number 3, which said to the enslaved people, we ain't going for no lazy people now. There'll be no idleness. You are no longer under our protection. If you don't work, you're a vagrant. And if you are a vagrant, we can arrest you and re-enslave you and put you on a slave gang. And that is what started Section 3 of the Emancipation Proclamation Act, read in Galveston, was what began this notion of that prisoners can work for slave wages for the state to work off that. We're dealing with that even now. So in Dauphin County, I'm speaking to you from Dauphin County. It has 283,000 people in Dauphin County. There were 250,000 enslaved people in Galveston on the day he read that enactment. And those 250,000 people were told either work for your master or leave Texas. Now imagine everybody practically in Dauphin County being told, be gone in 30 days, unless you can work out a deal with your master to continue to work in his field. What kind of representation did the enslaved have? What kind of negotiation did they have for men who said, you ain't nothing but a slave to me, so 90 days, the general pulled out with his troops. Richard, he left behind 500 Black soldiers from the USCT, mostly from the 8th, the 23rd, and the 40th, the 8th, the 25th, and the 43rd, who were all Pennsylvanians, all freemen, were left in Galveston to protect the enslaved, to enforce the law against the Confederates, and to negotiate the freedom of 250,000 people. So Juneteenth was not a day where everybody broke out into picnics. They didn't have no barbecues on Juneteenth. They didn't have no parades on Juneteenth. It's called the Great Scatter. And Google Juneteenth, the Great Scatter. It went on for 18 months as people fled for their lives lest they be arrested under pretenses and re-enslaved. It took till 1868 before the Freedmen's Bureau and the AME Church tried to reunite families, which started the tradition of the reunion. And it took to 1870 with the passage of the 15th Amendment when the Masonic lodges began to have parades for the veterans, the African-American veterans, that we began to have parades. So the parades and the picnics and the family reunions, they started long after that, the era of fear and rage and resistance, which resulted in people in a condition as usual, enslavement. So it wasn't that they were ignorant, you all, that they didn't know they were free. They were like, as long as this man got this gun in my head, as long as I have nowhere to live, no food on the table, and no place to work, you can read what you want, you can write what you want, you can pass what you want. But unless you enforce it, unless you make me free through military might and federal enforcement, my situation is the same as it was the day before you came.
I think that's important. And I think that's important what you just said, because people have to understand the whole concept of hearing the story. 2.5 years, folks don't know that they're free. Well, like you said, there was nobody to enforce it. And number two, people have to understand something. If you tell a person that they can leave, where are they going to go? They had nothing. I mean, even I have relatives that sharecropped. I make no bones about that. But people have to understand, where was wealth? We didn't have anything. So how were you going to go somewhere? Where were you going to go? All you knew is Mr. Charlie's farm. So now all of a sudden you tell me I can go, and I say, okay, but where am I going to go? So
and how am I going to get there, Richard? If I take a horse or a wagon, I have stolen something from him, and I can be put into chains and on the work. You know, if I take a bag of potatoes, where am I going to go? What is so? The first myth is the Juneteenth meant freedom. No, it took we're still trying to work out freedom. You know, like what Juneteenth did was end the fighting in Texas. What Juneteenth is turned 250,000 Black people out to their own devices. What Juneteenth did was to start a loophole which allowed you to arrest a man on vagrancy and put him into jail. You know, and what Juneteenth did was to start Jim Crow laws. And so at the very moment that we celebrate our freedom, we celebrate the birth of Jim Crow laws. So Juneteenth is a bittersweet day. You don't know how to say happy Juneteenth. Happy? No, not happy. You know, resilient, resistant, vigilant. You know, those are the words we use for the condition of Juneteenth well into the 20th century.
Okay, I think you gave a perspective, and I wanted the people to understand this whole concept. Is about that 2.5 years. So I'm gonna talk off of that because I got a number of things that I asked you about, and I was gonna originally, before we go to reparations for slave owners, I mean, is there any other emancipation myths that we need to know about?
So the first emancipation myth is the myth of freedom, that you are only free if the law is enforced. And we know that, Richard, into the 21st century, because we still have only a Civil Rights Act, a Voting Rights Act. These things expire like your milk, like the freshness on the side of your yogurt, you know, and we do not have unconditional rights. We have conditional rights, conditional bills. And if we don't stay vigilant, so Juneteenth was about the vigilance that it took to actualize freedom. And that's what we are celebrating. We're celebrating resilience. But when you talk about the whole issue of the myth of freedom, the second myth is the myth of subordination, because people didn't wait, they acted. The Freedmen's Bureau, the Sons of Goodwill, who buried Black soldiers, the Prince Hall Masons, the Odd Fellows, the Henry Highland Garnet. We organized the first National Negro Conference was in February of 1866, only 2 months after the 13th Amendment. So we have been organizing, we have been strategizing. The issue is the moment we get powerful, we get decimated, either through eminent domain, which decimates our neighborhoods, or through race and riots like Tulsa or Seneca Village or Wilmington, North Carolina. These moments where Black business and Black enterprises rises up, so you literally burn it out, or you reconstruct it through changing, redlining. You can go through history and you can look at periods where we have risen up. 1838, where Pennsylvania, I get excited. It's important for you to know that African-American men voted in Pennsylvania until 1838, when the Constitution of Pennsylvania was changed and Black men in Pennsylvania lost the right to vote. Therefore, the 1870 passage of the 15th Amendment, especially for Black men in Pennsylvania, is an act of reparation, Richard. It's an act of returning the vote to us, which we lost again in 1896, which we lost again in 1920, which we lost again in 1939 and 1956. And it's why we have to have a Voting Rights Act. And it's why if we don't watch out today, the state of Texas voted that Trump didn't lose the election. Texas, the day after Juneteenth, returns us to the assumption of white supremacy. This is tantamount to me as a historian to the firing on of Fort Sumter. It's the beginning of a civil war. And if you don't believe that a civil war, just look at the U-Haul full of white supremacists on their way to a gay pride, or the hundreds of men in Klan uniforms, no hoods needed anymore, Richard, no mask needed anymore, marching across the Lincoln Memorial in April, So we are at militias and Minutemen and acts of the last fear of old white men that they are going to lose supreme power. And this is a gun-clad, militia-bound, fearful time. Today in our news, where we hear that the woman who worked for voting rights in Arizona's house was broken into by the far right. We are at 1865. We are at Plessy versus Ferguson, 1896. We are at Dred Scott. We are at Woodrow Wilson segregating the White House. We are at the changing of polling places. We are at the literacy acts. We are living the past. And this is why, as a historian, I am so vocal, because this is not sepia tone history. This is blueprints for how we got over. This is master plans for how to deal with the struggle. This is strategic, notes left to the people who carried this torch before, and this is economic genocide this time.
Well, I agree, but I think I want to take this whole thing we said, the real deal. I think people have to sit back and perspective. And you said it. I want my audience to think about that. The Civil Rights Act of 1964. Audience, think about that. I said 1964. The Voting Rights Act of 1965. Think about those things. And we're all celebrating Juneteenth way back, but at the same time, look where we are today. We have accomplished some things, but we still have a long way to go. And that's why I think it's very important that, yes, these things are happening and we talk about June 15th, and then we sing, lift every voice and sing, but we have to keep focus on certain things. And there's certain things that we have to keep focus on. Education. We as a people got to do a better job of education. We got to learn to read and write. We have to hold our kids accountable as well as our schools accountable. Education is important. Voting. Think about this. As you talk about Juneteenth and all the things that all these folks went through, people don't want to vote. What do you mean you don't want to vote? You don't want to register to vote? Well, y'all see what's happening. So don't be crying. In the midterm election and the next president election in 2024. It's very important we start to develop the legacy now. Look at all of this conversation we have, and we're talking about these enslaved people, and yet we won't vote. Yet we walk around with guns and just shooting up everybody, drugs infested in our neighborhoods, and we doing some of that ourselves. We need to take June 15th, if that's what we want to believe, and say we're going to use that as a beacon to better ourselves, because nobody can tell me that all those people got the notice that they were free would think that their ancestors are where we are right now.
Richard, let me catch up with you because so many really, really incredible things. First of all, so I said the first myth is the myth of freedom. Freedom is a muscle that you need to work on all the time or it atrophies. And for us, freedom is a conditional thing. We have an act. 1964 and 1965 Voting Rights and Civil Rights Acts come 100 years after this, after Juneteenth. It's no mistake that on the centennial anniversary, we have to pass another act. We have to march again. Now here we are, you know, and I want to talk to young people for a minute.
Sure.
The average young person graduates from high school at 18 with the right to vote, and the average first time that people of color vote is about ages 25 to 30. Now, that means that for 7 years, you are not participating in the franchise. You know, and it's not about who is president or senator every 2 years. It's about who is dog catcher, who is school board director, who is the council member, who is mayor, you know, who is magistrate judge is going to act on you or marry you. The local election is the first place that a generation of people between 18 and 30 could make powerful. The same people who are out there shouting for Black Lives Matter in 2020 needs to be registering those young people to vote so that they can ensure, and secure that they matter. To lose a decade, to lose 15 years before you participate is to deny the ancestors of their dream. Their dream is you. Their dream is that you wake up, you know? Their dream is that you will enforce, and it's always been young people. It was the young people in Birmingham. It was the young people in Soweto. It was the young people in Tiananmen Square. It's always been young people. So young people cannot say, well, my vote doesn't count anymore. Or I don't trust them anymore anyway. You know, we need to vote in every election and for every position open. And in fact, if you don't like the way it's being done, then you need to train yourself to run for that position and take that seat, because it is that empowerment of land, jobs, and vote. That is the triangle, the equilateral triangle. And the fire in the middle pyramid of that equilateral triangle is education and literacy. Literacy on every level, not only be able to read, but to read culture, to read civics, to read the condition, you know, because we're as close to we're as close to civil war as we've been since fires burning in the streets in the 60s and 70s. And if we don't act now in 2024, then national election, we will be fighting in the streets. And it's dangerous. It's dangerous. You asked me a question about reparation. Well, Lincoln tried to repair DC as an experiment, and he was told by Seward and by Cameron and all those people, we don't have enough money in the treasury. By the end of the Civil War, there were 5 million people. America would have imploded if they attempted to pay 5 million, you know, times 500 to $1,000, you know. So that's one myth. The second myth is the myth of perpetual slavery, where people, Ben Cameron said this today, Richard. Well, but there's always been slavery. Every culture has had slavery. No, not like America, not like chattel slavery. In most cases, you conquered the fiercest, strongest warriors, and you sold them into enslavement so that you could remove them. And so if you put your fierce warriors, Richard, on a ship of the Middle Passage, and they survive the Middle Passage, and they survive slavery, and they survive Jim Crow, and they survive Woodrow Wilson segregating the White House, and they survive Ida B. Wells and the lynching, we're talking about heroes. Now, they may have jobs like garbage man or plumber or carpenter, but these are heroes. These are fierce warriors. So we went through 30 years as Black people of being ashamed to talk about our families being sharecroppers or enslaved people. Those are red badges of courage. Those are medals of honor. That means that you survived. You survived all that. And it's your obligation to the generations that come after you to not only survive, but to thrive. It's your obligation to be involved. It's your obligation to be enterprising. You know, I mean, affirmative action means to affirm, but then you got to act, children. You know, so ain't nothing promised you, you know, except faith, solidarity, and endurance. And that's what we need to activate on Juneteenth of 2022. We have to rededicate ourselves. I don't got nothing, I have no problem with the picnics, Richard, because they were started by the Freedmen's Bureau to bring families back together. I don't have any problem with the parades because they were started with the Elks and the Masons to honor Black veterans. You know, I have no problem with the marches, which Plessy started in 1896. Martin Luther King used Juneteenth, you know, as the Poor People's March. It is a day on the calendar that we can recommit to all that. It's all that. We own it all. Have your picnic, but don't forget to register somebody to vote. Have your parade, but don't forget to take action in your community and to make change. Have your party, sing and dance, but don't forget to stand outside of City Hall every time you see an injustice. Then we'll be doing right by the ancestors, and we'll be making Juneteenth more than just a day off.
I think that's important, and I think we need to stay focused on that. I realize that sometimes when people think of Martin Luther King Day, they see it as a day off, and I'm sure that there's people that saw this holiday as being a day off. But I think what's important that we need to take that day and drive not only our passion, but what we believe in and what we need to represent. Because as I said to you earlier, and I want the audience to think about this, just think about what those people went through and where we are. And some of us have become very lax and just take everything for granted. We forget our forefathers have done a lot. And that's why I think it's very important that we have discussions like this when we talk about history. See, I'm a big believer that we need to know our history. We need to know our history. And unfortunately, we don't know our history. And a lot of us don't want to know our history, but we should know our history. And as we all know now, the way, I'll just use Texas as an example, of Florida, nobody wants to talk about critical race theory. We know that's a crazy statement. What do you mean you don't want to know what your history is? So if they don't want to teach it in the schools, then it's our responsibility to teach it to our people. Would you agree with that?
Correct. It's our responsibility. We can't drop our kids off at kindergarten and pick them up at graduation from college and expect that they're going to get the history of their people, the history of their struggle, or the road signs, as you said. The poem was wonderful, Richard, because it talks about the fields being full. It was June in Texas. Those plantation owners were saying, you better get back in that field or I'm going to blow your head off. It was.
I have another question too. And, people don't realize this. An audience, I want you to look it up. I want you to do some reading, do some research. Don't always listen to what I have to say or what Brother Lenwood says. Do your own research, follow up. Somebody said, I've read somewhere, it says the 13th Amendment, the 14th Amendment, and the 15th Amendment was really slavery by another name. Would you comment on that?
Well, it's very interesting. So embedded in the 13th Amendment is a line that says, slavery will be abolished in these United States, except for criminals who have committed acts against the state. So it implies that criminals are slaves, and acts against the state. And, we can go all the way down to Fetterman and his whole program about prison reparation. There are so many people who have written about the prison as the new Jim Crow, the prison is the new slavery. But we are practicing bondage, and men who come out of prison after 20 years and can't use a phone, Richard, or read an electronic billboard, or where do they go? Back into. So we are perpetuating. It's embedded in the 13th Amendment. The 14th Amendment is very interesting because the 14th Amendment, while you all think that it's about Black folks, if I was a woman or a member of the gay and lesbian and transgender community, my rights, if I was into gay marriage, if I was into abortion, my rights are secured in Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. So everybody should be out there promoting the perpetuation and the security of the 14th Amendment. 14th Amendment is under attack right now. And if you start dismantling Section 3, then you start dismantling Section 2 of that 14th Amendment, which deals with that you are a full and entitled citizen. Full and entitled means you are no longer 3/5. So it is in the 14th Amendment that we are ensured that we are a whole person and a whole vote. But yet, Richard, we still have the we still have a system where no matter whether the popular vote goes one way or another, the Electoral College, which was based upon the 3/5 law of the Constitution, still decides who finally makes a decision. So we're still under the guise of enslavement as long as we have an Electoral College, and we still have a division of the population based upon old slave law, the 3/5 Act. And so we have to look at the Electoral College. We have a number of items in the 15th Amendment, which deals with amalgamation, which was the free right for races to intermarry, was changed after Reconstruction to miscegenation, which is the legal enforcement forbidding intermarriage. So we went from integration rights before the war to miscegenation laws after the war. It took us to 1957 with Loving versus Virginia. You and I grew up under passing for white, laws, imitation of life, outing people, brown bags. We grew up under how Black people feel about Black people. Y'all need to fix that, by the way. That Alpha Phi Alpha being sued into the 21st century, and AKAs being sued into the 21st century over the brown bag rules about light and dark. And, until we fix how we feel about each other, until we get out from underneath that European myth and bias about the color of skin and the texture of hair, we are enslaved by our own suppression of the joy of what we look like, how we look. And we're also suppressed by our joy and our humor, Richard. For 200 years, the American stage with minstrel shows took the fact that we love to sing, that we love to laugh, that we love to dance, and turned it against us and trivialized us by thinking that our love of color, was being bodacious, being loud, as they used to say. Our love of music and joy and laughter is being like a minstrel. Don't smile, don't show your teeth. I mean, we have all these biases. My mother, God love her, bleached my skin until I was 18 years old because I didn't look like the Hamilton brothers. Sorry about that. But Richard, you know what I mean. I could not pass the brown paper.
What do you have to say? Time is running real fast here, and we only got about a minute or two. So what would you want to leave my audience with in the last 3 minutes of this show?
I would say in the last 3 minutes of the show, I would say, that it is all right to sing and dance and party and picnic and parade on Juneteenth. But remember that Juneteenth is really a day for us to honor the ancestors by rededicating ourselves to the struggle. That's one. Two is get with pride of self as a race until we stop dogging each other about color of skin and texture of hair, until we rise up our beautiful Blackness in all its possibilities. Then we are condemned by a Victorian thought of being less than we are. And the third is use your dollar like you use your vote. Vote Black. In Black, you know, everybody. Now, they're frightened of that. They'll burn out Tulsa. They'll burn out Wilmington. They'll burn out Germantown. You know, they'll destroy the Eighth Ward through, but still we have the responsibility to rise to our full greatness and our full power, and our dollar and our vote should be tandem.
Ladies and gentlemen, I know today we just threw a whole lot at you, and I know that you're probably wondering, what's the point? The point is this. It's did you know? Second point is, what are you going to do about it? And we need to take this whole Juneteenth thing and make it work for us. Do your research. Look at the 13th, the 14th, the 15th Amendment. Look at them, understand them. But the most important thing is take all of that, and we as a people of color, we got to do a better job for ourselves. So Lenwood, I want to thank you.
And Richard, I'll leave your guests and your listening audience with the words of Frederick Douglass, who said, agitate, agitate, agitate. Unless you push for change, it will not happen. It will not happen. It needs everybody on the front line.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining the Richard Utley Show on The Voice 17104. We will be here on The Voice 17104 every first and third Tuesday from 6:30 p.m. to 7:30 p.m. Once again, thanks for viewing. Remember to visit us on Facebook at Richard Utley, and we welcome your questions and or comments.